video, I'm going to show you how to make a modern coffee table. And I'll start by ripping these pieces down on the table saw. Being that all the pieces don't seem to be the same width, I'm going to make sure I take off one cut off each side first. Then I'll make some adjustment on the table saw, and then I'll flip the board around and then make one final cut just to make sure that I have straight edges on both sides. And after all the pieces are cut, I'm going to set up a quick jig on my table saw so that I can get some consistency and cut in 45-degree angles. And making these miter joints is still a bit tricky even though you're setting it up on a table saw, because you have to keep this perfectly aligned so that we can get some tight miter joints. If miter joint seems to be a bit intimidating, you can always just use regular butt joints in this situation. And for these smaller pieces, I find it a bit easier using my circular saw. And with all the pieces cut, we should have 4 pieces. We should have the 2 sides and also the top and bottom. Now it will be a bit tricky to get to the inside and sand once this box is already assembled together. So prior to assembling, I'm just going to sand all the pieces down as smooth as possible. And I'll start with 120, then I'll move up to 220 grit sandpaper as final. The wood glue will play a major role when it comes to holding this entire coffee table together. You want to make sure you put wood glue on both pieces of the miter joint. Before nailing or screwing, depending on the way you put this together, you want to make sure that your joints are squared. The end result will reflect the way you start, so be sure you take your time and get this piece right. The wood glue will be doing the majority of the bonding. The nails is just a placeholder right now so we can put the box together and move on. And once this side is done, you can move on to the opposite side and do the same thing. And after the 3 sides is all glued together, I'm going to allow enough time for the glue to dry before I come back and add the final piece. And to add the final piece, I'm going to use the same process that was done previously. And since we're working with mitered corners here, the band clamp seems to work well, especially when trying to put pressure on all the corners. So I've given enough time for everything to dry, and now I'm going to come back with some wood filler and fill in all the nail heads. And if you happen to have any gaps in your mitered joint, this is probably the time to add some wood filler as well. And after the wood filler is dry, just hit it once more with a sander, sand it for the final time, then we'll take a rag, a damp rag, and wipe the surface to remove any sand dust. I actually like the light color of the wood, but if you want to stain it as well, you can totally go for it. But to put a protective coat on it, I'm going to use polyacrylic as my final top coat. As long as you follow the instructions on the can, you should be fine. In this case, I used 3 coats of the polyacrylic, and in between each coat, I used a 300 grit sandpaper and 400 on the final one. And as far as the in-between coats, I just used a hand sander and I just followed the grain on the wood, and that was pretty much it. Now of course you can always make the legs you desire or purchase the legs you desire, but for this project I really like the way the hairpin legs look, so this is what I went with for this project. I used a combination square to make sure I placed all the legs in the same spot and everything looked consistent. Each leg was placed an inch in from each side. Just pre-drill your hole and install the screws. Believe it or not, that's it for this one, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and be sure to subscribe to Home Edit for more content like this in the future. I'm Glenn from DIY Creators, and I will see you next time. nightstand, and you'll need one 1x12 by 48 inches piece of lumber, and you'll also need 4 1x2 measuring at 48 inches long. To begin, I cut off the rough end on the piece of lumber. To make these cuts, I'm going to use a circular saw crosscut jig. I'll place all the dimensions in the video description. The first cut I'll make will be for the bottom since it is the largest piece. Then I'll cut the 2 sides and then the top. And to make the legs, I start by measuring the back side of the legs, and that's 22 inches long. And while I'm cutting that, I'll make the second one for the second leg. Next, I'm going to cut the top part of the leg, and one side is going to be made at a 22-degree cut. Now I'm going to use the one I just cut as a template to make the second cut. The next cut will be the bottom of the leg, and that too will get a 22-degree cut on one end. The final cut will be for the front part of the legs, and both ends will be at a 22-degree cut. Now I did cut the front part of the leg longer than it should be to give me room for error. And now to fine tune the front part of the legs, I'm going to use a framing square to square up the outside and then double check on the inside to make sure everything was straight. Next, I'll mark the spot that I need to cut. So most of these joints will be made up of dowels, and I'll use a dowel jig to make the holes. Now after the holes are drilled, it should look something like this. Now I don't use dowels much, but in a situation like this, dowels provide a strong joint and you're not able to see any screws. Now to transfer these holes over to the next piece, I'm going to use these dowel pins. Now press it up against the wood, and these should mark the location of where you should drill your holes. This makes it a whole lot easier on where to drill the holes. Now my suggestion is you don't use a regular freehand bit to just drill these holes. You want to have a bit with a collar, or you tape it on where to stop so you don't go all the way through. Now you'll want to test your joints to make sure it fits together perfectly before you add the glue. I only put the dowels on the back side of the legs, being that the front is at an angle. It makes it a little difficult to put the dowels in. It can be done, but it's a little more time consuming. In this case, I'm going to use my nail guns to nail the front on. Now you want to check your squaring again just to make sure you're on the right track. Now using the glue and the nail gun, that would make this joint pretty strong as well. And now I'm going to add clamps to hold all the joints together while they dry, and then I'll do the same thing for the next leg. And now to make the top of the nightstand, it's going to look something like this when it's done. And now I'm going to mark all the locations for the dowels. So at this point, I've drilled out all the holes for the dowels. I'm going to add glue, then I'm going to install the dowels. I started by placing all the dowels in the bottom, then I went to the side. Then after I hammered that down, I started with the top. If you notice, I had a 5th dowel on the top so that I had added strength, being that the top is suspended. And now I'll add the final side. Now the piece of lumber I'm using do have a slight warp to it. I don't have a joiner or the right tools to straighten this out, so in this case I'm counting on the clamps that it can pull the middle in and close up the gap. Now add a lot of clamps, check for squaring, and use a wet rag to remove all the glue squeeze out. Now I'll use some wood filler to fill in the nail holes, and then I'll also add some at the joints. Now as you can see, I flooded the top with wood filler as well, and this is to help hide all the imperfection. Then I'll take the sander and smooth all that out. Now my first pass through with the sander, I used 150 grit, and for the final stage of sanding, I came back with a 220 grit, and that should help smooth it out and ready for finish. And now I'm going to apply paint primer, which should help the paint stick even better. Now as the primer is drying, I'm going to move on to adding stain on the legs. I'm using a golden pecan stain. To apply the stain, I'm going to use a rag method. Pretty simple, just use the rag to apply the stain and then use a clean rag to remove the stain. And ideally you'll want to use a rag that's lint free. And for the final finish, I add 2 coats of white latex paint. And to add a layer of protection, I'm going to use a wipe-on poly, which you should also use a lint-free rag. And after the first layer dried, I use a 220 grit sandpaper, lightly sand that, then I apply the second coat. And now I'll mark a few mounting holes to attach the legs to the top. And since I only had 1-inch screws, I'm going to drill out the mounting area just enough so the screws can go through both pieces. And now to attach the legs, I'm going to offset the legs by 3/4 of an inch, going from the sides and also on the back. So if you notice, I do have a sheet of plywood laying down, and that helps with the offset as well. Now clamp the legs in place and tighten the screws up. You also want to pre-drill the hole before you install the screws. Thanks for watching, guys. Be sure to subscribe to Home Edit for more how-to videos like this one.